Welcome back to another episode of the Next Level Minds podcast. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, this is a podcast dedicated to those who want to reach a next level in their business, personal, or career life. Every other week, I'm blessed to sit down with a qualified guest and walk through their story of how they have gotten from point A to point B and overcame various adversities along the way. Today's guest has absolutely exploded the IT and entrepreneurial industry. I'm blessed to be sitting down with John Espey, the CEO of Lobby CRE, which is a data analytics management platform designed for commercial real estate. I'll briefly walk you through John's story. He joined a startup called Amintra in 2003, ultimately became its COO as he scaled it and ultimately sold it to Red Hat in 2008. He spent 2 years running a middleware consulting for Red Hat until he left in 2010 to start a smart grid company called NextGrid. He ran that as COO for 3 years before stepping down from the day-to-day operations, and he raised $10 million for it in the process. Then he launched Reward Summit, a credit card marketing app platform, and they were blessed to be featured on the App Store, learned a ton about payments, mobile wallets, UI, UX development, DevOps, and cloud automation. Then he pivoted and launched Level, a service-based IT consulting firm, and under John's leadership, he grew Level to over 200 people in 10 offices on 4 different continents. Him and his team grew Level to $40 million in annual revenue, and also Level is recognized as the top 6% fastest growing companies in America. Since stepping down from Level, he has invested in 8 or 9 startups and joined several board of directors and advisory boards. And as I mentioned prior, John is currently the active CEO of Lobby CRE. And just wanted to personally thank each and every one of you for tuning in. Today's episode is going to be packed with a ton of value, going through topics on entrepreneurship, startup funding, and a ton of different things as well. So make sure you get excited for this one. And thank you again for tuning in to this week's episode of Next Level Minds. John, I just want to thank you for having me in your studio and really taking the time to be a guest on the Next Level Minds podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Of course. So based on that brief introduction that I gave the listeners, obviously you know yourself a lot better than I do. What do you want everyone out there to know about you?
Wow. I don't know. One thing that I'd like for them to know about me, I think you did a good job covering the bases. I think with me, I like to do lots of different things, and I think that's why I've been a career consultant, because consulting lets you work in a lot of different industries with a lot of different people, a lot of different technologies, solving business problems. And at the end of the day, I think that's what drives me is solving problems for sure. Yeah.
So you mentioned you were a problem solver, and just on conversations that we have, I can tell you're very innovative. Can you walk us through how you grew up? I mean, were you always a problem solver, or where did you really begin this type of innovation?
Sure. So I grew up in Northern Virginia, born in Alexandria and moved out to the suburbs at a pretty young age. I grew up in Ashburn, Virginia, and when I was in undergrad at George Mason, that was a real interesting time to be in that part of the country. The .com craze was going, and AOL was headquartered in Ashburn at the time. So everybody who grew up in Northern Virginia knew somebody who was an AOL millionaire. There were, AOL made thousands and thousands of millionaires. And so I think that probably colored some of my thinking and kind of drove me towards technology. At George Mason, I was studying accounting. I thought I wanted to be an accountant like my father. And as I saw what was happening in the IT industry, that became very interesting to me. And so I picked up another major in the business school that they called Decision Sciences and Management Information Systems. And that was enough to get me a job as a consultant at a company called Talon, which was where I really learned how to do IT consulting, how to build software products, and how to really develop code. I was doing a lot of Java development and then kind of branched out into other programming languages.
So did you make that pivot of just adding a different field of study kind of based on the .com bubble, or were your parents or friends kind of pushing you to go that route, or did you say you made that yourself?
I would say that I made that decision kind of on my own. I don't think my parents pushed me in any direction. I think they just wanted me to finish school. I took 6 years to get an undergraduate degree, and not because of the 2 degrees, but more just because I just goofed off for a while. So I think there were a lot of different people who were telling me, you can't be an accountant with your personality. I don't know that they would have said I should go into software development, but I think a lot of people were telling me to think about consulting rather than a career in accounting.
Yeah.
And at some point I just decided, I think I was working as an accounting temp at a software development consulting company called TechLaw, and they needed help with something that I happened to be learning in school. And so I went and did some software development for them. And once I figured this problem out for them, they said, you're not working in the accounting department anymore. And they moved me into IT. So there were a whole lot of factors that were kind of pushing me in that direction. But you could see when you go interview, I would do the on-campus interviewing, and it was literally 50% higher starting salaries on the software development side than it was on the accounting side. So that it was pretty clear where I needed to go.
Yeah. Did you work through school, or how did that really work to get some experience?
So I worked in a retail setting. I worked at a couple different car stereo shops. And then at some point I decided to go work at a temp agency. And they connected me to this company, TechLaw. And so I worked there for probably the last year and a half of my undergraduate journey. And I also had a job working for the school. The business school had set up an office for me and two of my counterparts, and we just did all sorts of IT types of projects for the business school.
Yeah, and then you joined Mintra in 2003.
Yeah, so after I mentioned the Talon experience, which was the first place that I worked. I worked there for about 2 years, and the .com collapse started and was well underway, and I went through 6 rounds of layoffs, and I made it out myself. And but I saw this startup. It was called Mintra, and they really knew how to sell. And the company Talon, where I was working, wasn't really all that good at selling. And I saw what they were doing at Mintra and thought, wow, I'd really like to learn from these folks. So I left at the beginning of 2003, March of 2003, and they were 8 people. So I was employee number 9, and they had a really good culture. They were led by some really talented people. Mike and Matt were the CEO and COO at the time, and I could just tell when I started talking to Mike, especially, which is who was my boss. I just knew I was going to learn a lot, and that was what was most important to me at that point in my career was what am I going to learn? Yeah.
So when you had these 6 layoffs, was there an anxious feeling that you were experiencing, or was it just like, hey, I'm going to get through this? Or what was really the mindset that you had during that time?
Yeah, I was never worried for myself, just because the vice president that I worked for gave me a heads up every single time and kind of told me who was going to go. So I wasn't nervous for myself. I think I was worried for the people around me. And it wasn't just our company. It wasn't because Talon was poorly run. It was the macro environment. You had September 11th. You had the Enron scandal. There was just a lot going on at the time, and there was a pretty nasty recession that happened. And I think I was anxious more for the other people, but I knew that my job was never in danger. And when you're in consulting, if you're on a project and billable, you're not going to get laid off because you're going to lose revenue. They only lay off the people that aren't on projects. And I was never on the bench, as they call it, for more than a week or two. So it wasn't an anxious time from my own perspective.
Yeah. And you mentioned that when you first started looking for careers and expanding into different fields, one of the main attributes you were looking for is how good of a learning opportunity is this? Would you offer that advice to people who are looking for their first careers, of just focus on the learning rather than, I'm getting paid X amount more? Or?
Yeah, that's the exact advice that I give to young people is really, you need 2 things out of your job. You need to grow your skills, and you need to grow your network. And as long as you grow those 2 things, the money will follow. People who job hop for the next $2,000 to $5,000 more per year, they may end up making more on a per year basis than somebody who grows their skills and grows their network. But I've had a couple of different paydays where I guarantee you I make more in that one payday than those people will make in 30 years of their career hopping. And that's a direct result of learning skills, taking calculated risks, solving challenging problems, looking out for opportunities and then building the network. And if you have skills in a network, that's how you find those opportunities.
Yeah.
For sure.
Why do you think there seems to be a culture right now of the whole job hopping for $2,000 more, like you mentioned, rather than I'm going to learn as much as I can?
Yeah, I think it's an easier way to go, and I think it's a more concrete thing. If you pay me $5,000 more per year, that's $100 more every week that I'm putting in my pocket. That's very tangible. I think in general, people have a tendency to play the short game rather than the long game, and so it's not an easy thing to do to think long term, and that's why I think so few people do it. But I do think that people understand the concept, and it's why I have a podcast that's pretty similar to yours, where I interview founders, and because I think people need to hear these stories and understand, hey, if you want to really be successful and happy, here's a path that you can take. I don't think starting a company is for everybody. I don't think it's for most people. But I think it's one path. I do think going and working for an earlier stage company with the founders, where you're able to actually work with the founders, is something that most people should try at some point in their life. But unfortunately, the older you get, the more responsibilities you have, the harder it is to do that type of thing, for sure.
Yeah. So would you suggest taking as many calculated risks as you can before the age of 30, or what's really the advice there?
Sure. And I don't know that it's an age thing. I mean, I think if you've got a risk that seems like a good one and that you think could be a good opportunity, you should think hard about it. And if you do run into those earlier in your career, it's a much easier calculation, I think. Whereas somebody who's I'm 43, so somebody my age who's got 2 kids and is thinking about paying for college, and they've got a mortgage and they've got other things that they've got to do, it might be harder to take that risk. Now, the flip side is, I see people all the time starting companies in their mid to late 30s, and they've got more money, they've got more wisdom, and they've got more of a network, and so they can be very successful. It's just sometimes harder to take those risks because it's more than just yourself that you're putting at risk. Yeah,
100%. So after Amentra, you spent 2 years doing consulting for Red Hat, then, or really, how can you walk us through that process?
Sure. So Amentra was a consulting company, about 130 people at the time, that we sold to Red Hat, and we sold in 2008. We were going to raise money we were looking at raising money from a couple different private equity funds, and had some really good offers and some interesting opportunities. And Red Hat found out about it. We were their biggest partner. They had acquired a company called JBoss, which was a middleware platform that they were having trouble selling. And we were JBoss's biggest partner. Red Hat hears that we're raising money, and they said, "Why don't we just buy you?" And it was a real gut check for the entire executive team, but we decided it was the right way to go because the financial crisis was flaring up, and Red Hat actually did pretty well during that time and was a very well-run company financially. They had no debt. They had about $1 billion in liquid assets. And so we felt like that was a better place to be and a better exit for us, rather than raising some private equity money and trying to really blow it up and then sell it. So Red Hat buys us and wanted we were a consulting company and sell consultatively as a result. And that's the kind of sale that JBoss needed, was somebody who could come in and really explain how this middleware works and how you build applications on it. And so they already had an existing team of consultants. I think there were about 18 people in North America. Yeah. And my task, I was running the day-to-day of Amentra by then, and then Red Hat Middleware Consulting was to figure out, how do we work these two teams together? When you do services as a services company, standalone like Amentra was prior to the acquisition, you're looking at a business problem and coming up with the best solution, and the product may happen to be JBoss, it may be an IBM product, it may be maybe a Microsoft product. When you're owned by Red Hat, and when you are Red Hat, the solution is Red Hat. It's pretty simple. And so their team of 18 consultants was much more focused on the nuts and bolts of the Red Hat technology, and our team was broader and more kind of problem solvers. And so my job was to figure out, okay, how do we merge these two teams together and then position it to grow? And now if you look, I think that team is probably 700 people in North America at this point.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was it just you yourself kind of come up with these solutions, or did you have a team of consultants that were working on that?
Yeah. So we had a whole team that was working on it. I was in charge of the team. And what I did was I I divided the country into 3 regions, the Central, the East, and the West Coast. And I had one person running each of those regions. And then East Coast was by far the biggest presence because that's where Amentra historically was. And so there were probably 3 or 4 people who reported in to that person who was running the East Coast. But anytime you do something like that, it's definitely not one person. I did a lot of flying and oversaw the integration, but there were probably 20 people at the end of the day that were really responsible for putting that did a lot of the work, putting that all together.
Yeah. Did you feel a lot of pressure having a task that big just kind of thrown onto you, or?
I didn't look at it that way because we had such a good team, and Red Hat is such a great company and was growing very fast at the time. They've recently been acquired by IBM, but I don't think I felt any real pressure. There was nobody. There was pressure every quarter to get deals done, and we were doing some really big deals, and so it was more pressure like that. But the task of integrating when you've got a good team is not really all that stressful, frankly.
Yeah. So, do you have any advice out there for anyone that may be dealing with some pressure in their career? For myself, for example, I'm just now getting to the point where I'm taking on a significant amount more of responsibility within my role. And it's, I've never really had that before. So it's every day like, oh my gosh, like what if I mess this up? And I know a lot of my listeners out there also are kind of getting to that phase in their career. So how do you really deal with that internal pressure that happens?
Sure. So my first advice to people is to just take a deep breath. and remember that it's only work, and mistakes. Hopefully you're in an environment where mistakes aren't penalized. I'm a big believer that it's okay to make mistakes. I think if you're not making mistakes, you're not taking on big enough challenges. You need to learn from your mistakes and not make the same mistake twice. But I think that's the first thing that I tell people is just remember, you get do-overs, you can make mistakes, make sure you learn from them. But more than anything, I think you need to be able to communicate up, you need to be able to communicate down, and you need to be able to communicate sideways, and you need to manage expectations. And if you're in a pressure situation, identify why it is that you're feeling pressure and figure out, is it because it's truly the end of the quarter and I've just got to get this deal done? Well, there's going to be pressure because we need to hit our quarterly numbers. If you're feeling pressure because somebody doesn't like you, or you're feeling pressure because you don't get along with somebody, those are things I think you need to confront them and bring it up and not hide from it, and don't hide behind passive aggressive techniques. I try to be, some people call it genuine, but I think you need to be transparent with people. You need to be honest with people, and you need to hold them to that standard, and you need to set that expectation that's how you want to work. But that may not be why you're feeling pressure. You may be feeling pressure because you think you're in over your head, and that's a good place to be. You should always be in over your head. You're not growing if you're not in over your head. If you're completely comfortable, you're not moving forward. Success doesn't come from doing the easy things, and it's nice to have periods where you're comfortable and like, okay, I've got everything under control. But growth happens when you challenge yourself and when you challenge the people around you. And so if you're feeling pressure because you're growing, I would say, learn to channel that pressure, thrive off of it. And, I don't have a good technique or easy way to do that. But if you can reframe it and look at it that way and say, no, this is part of the growth process, I think you start to understand that pressure is a good thing. And that, that makes it a lot easier to deal with that pressure, I think. Yeah,
I totally agree. And I feel like, unfortunately, sometimes in corporate America, sometimes the communication can be off between the executive leadership, the VPs, all the way down to kind of the middle level management. But then again, like you mentioned, I think just properly communicating yourself to everyone around you can really help kind of separate yourself apart and take some pressure off.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know you touched on this earlier with entrepreneurship, and you touched on that you don't think it's for everyone. I have a lot of people out there that listen, and myself, who really aspire to start a company one day. How can you really pinpoint those traits in yourself at an early age to say like, okay, I'm an entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. I don't know that there's any one thing. I know a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot who've been successful, a lot who are back in corporate careers now and didn't have success, but showed a lot of the traits that do drive success. And I would say if there's one common theme in most of them, it's just a confidence, not a cockiness, not an arrogance, but a confidence in themselves. And that sometimes takes a little bit of time to develop. but I think that the confidence, and because you're going to make a lot of decisions and you're going to fuck a lot of them up, frankly.
Yeah.
and it takes a real confidence in order to be able to do that and to keep coming back to it. And but the other thing that I think I commonly see, but it's probably less common than the confidence, is the ability to stick with something even though you're failing, but then be able to pivot and be able to kind of stick the landing of don't stay at something for too long that isn't going to be successful. Don't get so tied to that thing that you don't see the real opportunity and make the pivot or make the change to drive success. And I think that's probably the hardest part of entrepreneurship is sometimes people get so wound up in their product that they don't realize the market has already passed them, and they won't change, and they won't admit that they're wrong, and they won't admit, it isn't that they won't admit that they're wrong. It's just that they are so focused on it. But it's hard because you need that focus and you need to not give up at the first sign of a challenge, but you can get stuck doing it. And that's I think the hardest part. One of the hardest parts about being an entrepreneur is figuring out kind of that balance between sticking with something but not sticking with it for too long.
Yeah. Do you think that people around you, you should really try to surround yourself with friends and family who are supporting you through your failures? Or like, what advice out there do you have for people who just want to go at it solo? Because I know a lot of people like that too.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of great entrepreneurs who do it on their own without a real partner, but most people who drive to massive levels of success are going to have people around them who are bought in, maybe with ownership, or just bought in and feel like they're part of that founding team or decision-making team. If you don't have those people around you, I would say try to find those people. Even if you end up being the only person making decisions on your team, you're going to want some advisors around you who can support you. Having your friends around you is okay, but you're going to end up in an echo chamber. And I think you need some people from outside your your normal inner circle or your personal inner circle. It's not to say you don't want people who are, your day one friends.
Right.
But you're going to have a groupthink. You're going to have an echo chamber, and you need a diversity of ideas. You need people who will question you. You need people who will make you think about things differently. And it's rare that you're going to find that from your true inner circle, especially when you're younger. When you get a little older, I've got 5 or 6 distinct groups of friends, and I can see different traits across those different groups. But when I was younger, if I had just surrounded myself with my own people, I would have had a very one-sided view of the world.
Yeah, of course. So with NextGrid, I know you started that after consulting for Red Hat, right? That's
correct.
Okay, so I know you went with NextGrid and then you launched Reward Summit, correct?
Yeah, so NextGrid was, I was the COO.
Okay.
I've known the CEO for a while, and he had invented some technology and wanted to commercialize it. And so he asked me a year before I ended up leaving Red Hat to join him in starting it. And he, at that point, was just tinkering with some technology. And then about 6 months later, he had won a contract, and he had to put a company together at that point.
Oh, wow. And then he called you.
He called me and said, hey, we've been talking for a while. And he knew that I had work to do at Red Hat still, and a couple of earn-out payments to earn. But he said, hey, I just want a deal. I need to go raise some money. I need to put a team together. Like, can you come now? And I said, well, let me invest some money. Let me get some investors together, and let me help you with that. And then, I'll join you in 6 months. And in fact, I was planning on joining a little later. I wanted to stick around for 3 years initially. And at the end of 2 years, I ended up joining him because he had won another contract, and it was very clear that they needed a COO at the time. And so that was how we started NextGrid. I spent about 2.5 years putting together a supply chain, because NextGrid manufactures equipment and does software. So I helped put a software team together. I helped put the initial supply chain together, and then worked with putting a sales team together. And I just realized that it wasn't an industry that I wanted to be in for what I felt were going to be the 10, 15 most productive years of my career. So NextGrid's still going strong. They're chasing a game-changing big contract. I talk with the CEO fairly regularly. I'm still a shareholder. I sit in on the investor meetings. But it just wasn't going to be where I wanted to spend the second half of my 30s and my 40s, which is where I feel like you're kind of at your most productive in many cases. And so I moved on, did some independent contracting for a little bit, and then came up with this idea for a reward summit that you've talked about.
Yeah. So when you first went with Next Grid, you were early 30s or mid 30s, you said?
Yeah, that was 2010, so I would have been 34.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a follow-up question on Next Grid, and then I want to move on to Reward Summit.
Sure.
You mentioned pulling together investors, and to be honest, you said that kind of casually.
Yeah.
But that's just a really next-level topic that we could probably have 15 episodes on.
Sure.
So just in a couple minutes, I mean, anyone out there who's making some traction in their company but wants to, pull together investors casually, like you mentioned, what's some really like steps or things that they can do to put themselves forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's no one size fits all answer here. I'll tell you first what it meant in my case. He had a couple of investors he was already talking to, and if for anybody and we're not talking about trivial money. It wasn't a big round. He needed about $1 million to launch it.
Yeah.
And he had a very, very real needs for $1 million of capital. I mean, there was R&D that needed to be done. There's just, in manufacturing the hardware, there's some external costs where you're going to bring in people to come in and help you design the hardware. He needed to develop a bunch of software, and so there were very real costs. And then when you get your first deal, there's working capital requirements. You got to buy all of the different pieces and parts that are going to get assembled, and there's lead times, and then you assemble them, and that may be a couple of months assembling 10,000 electric meters or 10,000 units, so to speak. And then you're going to deliver them and send an invoice to the utility company, and then they're going to pay you 30 days later. So you've got to cover that working capital even once you've done all of the upfront R&D. But he knew that he needed about $1 million to get things moving. But he also had about $1 million of contracts in hand. So for him, raising money is different than for somebody who's saying, I've got an idea and I want to commercialize it. For what he was trying to do, he could have raised money from other groups, but it takes time. Even though he had a good business model, you've got to put a pitch deck together. You've got to convince people. You've got to come up with terms. It's just a time-consuming process. And so I said, let me see if I can get a group of investors together, because 2 years prior, we'd sold a Mentra to Red Hat. And so we knew some people who had some individuals who had money and had expressed an interest in investing in other things. So generally, when you make other people money, there's just an unwritten rule that the next time you go to make money, they'll invest.
Yeah, they'll help you out.
So it was pretty easy for me to go. I went to the founders of Amentra because I'd known that they'd made a good chunk of money. We went to the bankers who did the deal, because they had mentioned, if you ever come across something or you want to do, your next thing, let us know. We'd like to take a look. And in fact, the founder of that investment bank that sold us has now invested in two companies I've been involved with, and two or three that the founder of Amentra was involved with. And so when you're raising money, if you've got a network of people that you already know, whether you're raising $100,000 to do an MVP or a minimum viable product, or as in our case, it's, hey, we've invented the technology already. We've got a team. We just need to grow the team before we're going to start driving revenue. Always going to your own network is going to be faster. And even going to your own network still takes time. I think it took us about 3 months to get that deal done with people that all knew each other. And that's going to be generally the best case scenario. Usually you're going to spend more like 6 months, 9 months from start to finish before you start the process of raising money. And between then and when the wires start coming in, it's usually a pretty long process.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to early on in your career when you ask yourself the two questions: how can I learn the most, and how can I expand my network? And I feel if you didn't take those steps, it might not have been as easy to acquire the funding. But you did the initiatives to establish that network at a young age. So, yeah,
absolutely. And again, I wouldn't say go find the network, build your network for real specific things. I'm a big believer in building the network. You have to explore. You have to meet people. You don't necessarily know why you're meeting them or what you want from them. and in fact, you need to be thinking about how do you help them. And if you do that, you'll start to round out your network to people. These are people who will invest money. These are people who, may be a good salesperson in the future, or this may be someone who hires me, or they may start a company and I get to go help them. You really never know. And I think that's important when you're building your network, is not to try and focus on specific things and have a specific ask. Then it just looks like you're looking out for something, and you're going to get a quick reputation for being that type of person. You really need to be the type of person who you network because you want to help other people, and you understand you're playing the long game and they're going to help you. But the way we built Level was completely off of mine and my partner, which Level's the biggest success of any of the companies that I've been involved with, for sure. And Chris and I both, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later on in the interview, but we both always were those type of networkers. And if you look at how we built the team so quickly, it was largely tapping into our networks. And the beauty of that is once you bring in great people from your network, you then expand into their networks as well. And so now the way that Level's growing and continuing to grow to this day, there are people that neither Chris nor I directly know, because there's so many other great people that are decision makers in that company who are bringing in people from their network, and it just starts to multiply over time.
Yeah, and I think another follow-up on the network is really I try to never burn any bridges in business or personal relationships, because you never know when you might run into them again.
It's very true.
I think it's kind of funny because sometimes you easily just want to cut them off or something, but it's not going to cut out well for you in the long run.
Yeah. You definitely never want to burn a bridge. Some people are just assholes and the bridge needs to be burned. But my experience is most people, even if they do things that you perceive as bad, there's two sides to the story, and I try to keep that in mind with people, for sure. Yeah.
So Reward Summit, I know you were able to successfully launch on the App Store. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So Reward Summit was an idea that I had. My brother was getting married. We were at a bachelor party, and I went to pay for a pretty big tab for a bar tab one night. And I'd gotten a new credit card, and I couldn't remember which one was 5% cash back on restaurants. And I was talking with my dad, and I'm like, this is stupid. Like, why isn't there an app that figures this out for you? And my dad was like, well, if only you knew somebody who knew how to build an app. And at that point, it was game on. Like, he threw the gauntlet down.
And you're like, all right.
so I knew how to build an app, and I knew roughly how I would architect this thing. And I started thinking through it. And I went to one of my friends from grad school. I went to Duke, to the Fuqua MBA weekend executive MBA program. And I had started a company. I had built an app for a friend of mine, and we'd put a little bit of money into it, and we were still running with it. We'd launched it, and it was starting to make a little bit of money. And I didn't think I wanted to do this app full time, and he was a very successful investment banker, and he wasn't going to do it. And so we were already kind of thinking about, crap, do we go put more money in and go hire somebody? Well, I call him and I'm like, hey, I just had this idea. What if I built an app that does this? It figures out which credit card to use for depending on where you are. And we talked for like 2 hours on the drive back from Savannah. And he was like, you know what? Like, why don't we shut down the gold mine, was what we called this other app. And he said, I think this is a much better idea. He's like, I'll get some of the guys from the investment bank together. Why don't you go find somebody to help you build this, And so we did. I put some money in, and my friend Greg put money in, and a couple of his coworkers. So we had about $100,000 to go just build this app that I had the idea for. Somewhere along the way, I get introduced to Chris Hart, had spent 15 years with Bank of America and is just a brilliant technologist. And right away, we hit it off, and he got the idea right away. He said, here's how we can monetize it. And, he understood the industry, but he was also better at tech than I was. And we started developing it the night we met, and within a month, we had a version of the product working. And then it wasn't very good, but it was working. And then we raised a little bit. Well, actually, I said we raised $100,000. We raised 30 up front, and then we raised another 100 to go actually build it. And we did. A year later, we got it featured on the app store as the #1 finance category app, and they kept it up for a couple of weeks. And we had tens of thousands of users. It wasn't making much money. It was making a little bit of money. Definitely not enough to definitely not enough to pay the investors or anything. But we learned a whole lot in that process about user experience design. We learned a lot about payments. We just really, and we learned about modern kind of cloud architectures, which were just starting to gain mind share in the enterprise. But we never figured out how to make any real money with it.
Yeah. So when you thought of this idea and you started implementing it, were you also working somewhere else, or was it just solely focused on Reward Summit?
So I was doing, I was an independent contractor too. I had some friends that I used to work for at Talon who had started their own company, and they were doing one real specific thing in IT, and they wanted to go broader into application development. And so I had helped them build a couple of relationships. I was doing some billing for them for a couple companies, but they, when they saw the launch and they saw the blog posts about Chris and me, and they knew that what kind of hours we were working to keep the lights on this thing, they were like, we don't want to do this business anymore. We're shutting it down. And I said, well, do you mind if I take over the business? And they said, yeah, absolutely. We're fine doing that, and we wish you well. And so around that same time, Chris was doing the same thing with Bank of America. He was an independent contractor, and they had the same reaction. They were like, you cannot work here. Like just, it's a conflict of interest. And so we both were kind of shown the door on the same day. And I said, well, my friends over at CLD, is the name of the company, said I could have this business. Why don't we just do that? We'll do it for a week every month. We'll go bill somewhere. We bill, $200 an hour. You make $8,000 each. That's enough to pay our bills,
right?
And then we can work on Reward Summit the rest of the time. And so that's what we did for about 6 months. Yeah.
So it sounds like through all this building, I mean, you were working a ton, putting a significant amount of hours in.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was 4 hours of sleep tops at the time.
And what was really your motivation through this process?
I think having seen success at Amentra, we'd seen some success at NextGrid as well. I think that feeling of success and of doing something on your own is a real powerful motivator for me. I think just knowing that I'm getting something done and learning things is very motivating. And so that motivated me. I think with Reward Summit, it went to the next level because we were now being seen by tens of thousands of people, and I could see them through my analytics dashboard in real time, what they're doing with our product. And I'd see people opening up the app in Singapore, and a little, dot opens up on the Google Analytics dashboard in Singapore. And you're like, wow, this is crazy. And that's very motivating as well. And I think getting the feedback from customers, and we had a competitor, and I think that motivated me. I think all of those things are what were motivating me kind of at the time. Ultimately, you want to have success, but success has a lot of different meanings. I think having users using your product, or seeing them and knowing that people are out there using something that you were part of creating is just hugely motivating for me.
Yeah. What did you do? I know you mentioned you were getting around 4 hours of sleep a night. What did you do? And I'm sure you had these where you just did not feel like getting up in the morning and conquering the day, or were you rare and never had any?
I almost never have those kind of days.
Yeah.
I think maybe when I'm sick, I feel like that. And look, when I do have that kind of day, I had one recently where I twisted my ankle, and I did not. I couldn't move, right? And so I said, I'm just taking the day off. I'm just going to sit here and lay down and heal myself. And so when I do have those days where I'm like, okay, I cannot overcome this, I address it. I do whatever I need to do to get through, but I cut off the other thing. I'm not working today. I'm just not doing it. When I'm overwhelmed, I've got to walk away from this, and I've got to recover from it. And because you can't do both. But luckily I'm the type where I'm pretty optimistic by nature. And also luckily I've just got a good source of energy and a pretty good motor, and I'm pretty healthy. So it's very rare that I do have those days, luckily.
Yeah. So, this is really a broad question, but I'm going to give you the opportunity to hone in on it. With all this building, I want to touch on this before we move to level. What are some failures you may have had along this process that you wouldn't mind sharing?
Sure. Yeah, there've been plenty of failures. I mentioned the gold mine. We built this product, and we got it onto the App Store, and we had people, using it. And it was a product where you could create challenges for yourself or for others. And we had 4 or 5 categories. It could be quitting smoking, taking a class, losing weight, finishing a workout program. But the idea was to set a goal, and then we created a social, you could send out email invites, or you could connect with your friends on Facebook or your followers on Twitter. And then we created a feed of people who could give you encouragement along the way. And then you could take pictures and upload them. And people could literally make a contribution to you and say, if you hit this goal, I'm going to give you $20 or $50 or $100. And I thought it was a great idea. I still think it's a very good idea. We built it. It looked great. We built the interface with a company called WePay, which is a PayPal competitor. And it was really cool seeing, literally we had thousands and thousands of images of people that we didn't even know who were like posting pictures and you could see people losing weight through the thing. And it was really cool, but it was a failure ultimately because we decided to go after Reward Summit. Prior to that, I'd had a side project that I would always work on through the elementary years, and I called it Fit Tracker. And it was a fitness tracking application for P90X workouts or for running, keeping track of what shoes you're wearing so that you know when to buy new shoes. And it had all sorts of features, but I never commercialized it. Never really figured out how to do anything with it. It literally was just how I learned about 7 or 8 different technologies, but I failed to even create a final version of the product and get it in front of one customer. But the reason I finally gave up on that was the Goal Mine came along, and I repurposed everything from Fit Tracker into the Goal Mine, but neither of those turned into any kind of commercial success. And Reward Summit was the same way. We maybe made, I don't know, $2,000 of revenue throughout the life of this thing. And myself and other investors probably put $150,000 or $200,000 into it. And to only make $2,000 or $3,000 of revenue, that's a failure by any stretch.
Yeah, it is.
And it was funny but then you could argue that Level would have never happened without those 3. So were they failures? Not really. They were failures in one perspective, but if you learn from your mistakes, I don't know that you call that. I don't know that I look back at that and say, "Wow, that was a failure. I wasted my time doing that."
Yeah. What are some steps out there people could take of, if they have a failure, to really learn from their mistakes and really not just get hung up on everything that's happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think you've got to be able to be honest with yourself, and you've got to ask yourself, why did I fail? And what could I have done differently to not fail? And if the only answer you come up with is not take a risk, then I wouldn't dwell on it too much, because you're going to fail at things, right?
Right.
So I think the biggest key when you're looking at your failures is not to let the failure paralyze you from acting again, but to figure out what were the mistakes I made, and were there things that if I had done them differently, I might have had a better outcome. And it's hard to do that because most of us have a tendency to get defensive, even when we're looking at ourselves, and try and say, well, I'm going to make excuses. And that's where the confidence comes in, and the maturity and the ability to look at yourself. And I think if you can look at your failures and say, be very, very honest about it, you're going to become wildly successful if you can do that in a very honest way. Because most people have a lot more talent than what they're actually able to achieve. It's just that they're afraid to be honest with themselves and to look at things objectively and say, yeah, I really fucked up. I really could have done that a whole lot better. It's just not something that's a natural movement for most people. Yeah,
I've been doing this every night in my journal. I write down one way I could get better from the next day. Because I fail every day at small things. I'm sure you fail at some things too.
Oh, tons of things.
So I write down, what did I do today? What did I fail at, and how can I get better from them?
Yeah.
And I think it's those micro steps that end up lead to macro success down the road.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you spend any time like on mindset or gratitude journals or anything like that in your busy day? Like, do you think that really shapes it?
I don't have a gratitude journal, but I try to think about what I'm grateful for very actively. I try to meditate. And when I do meditate, once I get my mind clear, that's one of the things that I like to do is just think about what I'm grateful for, who I'm happy for, who in my life is making it better. I think when I do take the time to do that, it's very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
But I don't have an actual journal. I occasionally keep a fitness journal where I'll just keep track of how much running I do or how much time I'm spending in the CrossFit gym or doing yoga or in the sauna or doing all these healthy things, how much time I'm spending meditating or doing breathing exercises or float. I'm doing a float spa today.
Oh, nice.
And from time to time, I feel like I need to track that because I start to lose track of those things in my life, and I start to spend too much time on work and getting too into my, what I'm doing with work or with investing or the advisory work that I do. But right now, I'm at a point where I feel like I'm in a pretty good balance, and so I haven't been journalizing that stuff as much.
Yeah, and you're pretty big on fitness too, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Do you think that's a must-have for just any type of success to balance that with your hard work?
I think you need to have something that's an outlet. And for me, it's definitely exercise is the first thing I do every day. So it can't be taken away from me. If I did it at 5 p.m., which is probably a more natural time and probably when I would get more results from it, the problem would be that it would be very easy to get something scheduled during it and it moves away. So I'm adamant about the days that I do exercise, I'm going to do it first thing in the morning. But look, I think everybody could benefit from that. But whether it's a CrossFit workout like I like, or a session in the yoga studio, or going for a run, or even going for a walk, I mean, I think all of that is very healthy. But for some people, they just don't like it. I would say you should have something else that you're committed to that brings balance to your life.
Yeah, that's funny. So I try to lift weights 5 times a week, but one thing I just hate doing, and my girlfriend always gives me crap for it, is I hate running.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm really trying to get better at. Okay. At least 2 or 3 miles a week, but struggle.
Have you ever tried just doing wind sprints or?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so you can do it in whatever format you want. My favorite is a protocol called Tabata, and it's you can do Tabata with anything, back squats, whatever you want. You go as hard as you can for 20 seconds. Take 10 seconds to recover, which if you do go truly 100%, you're not going to recover fully. Then you do another 20 seconds, another 10, and you repeat that for 4 minutes. So you do 8 times 20 seconds. So it's 160 seconds of work. And they've actually found that it burns more calories through the day than running for 6 miles.
Oh, wow.
And so it's, you build an amazing amount of VO2 max or aerobic capacity, but you get it over with very quickly. And so if you don't like running 4 or 5, like for me to get a good run in, it needs to be 5 or 6 miles to really get anything out of it. And that's just a long commitment, and I get bored and it wears my knees down. So when I do run, I prefer to do the Tabata protocol, but especially if you can do it like on hills, it's just a really, really good workout.
And you said you could do it with weights too, or
you can do Tabata with pull-ups, you can do back squats, any weights that you want, any type of workout that you're doing. If you do 20 seconds followed by 10 seconds of rest and do it for 8 minutes, that's called Tabata. And it was a running coach in Japan. He literally tried all sorts of different intervals, and he came up with that as the most absolute efficient protocol for building aerobic lung capacity and building bursts of strength. He felt like it was the biggest bang for your buck that you could possibly get. I think I've experimented with 10 seconds and then 20 seconds of rest, or 20 seconds and a minute. You really, if you're doing a sprint, you really need 5 to 1 rest to work in order to actually recover. And there's something about just taking that short 10 seconds that just really makes your exercise very, very efficient.
Yeah, I'm going to take a mental note of that because I don't know about you, but I love a nice cigar.
Yeah.
So I need to increase that lung capacity on my workouts for sure.
I do like a good cigar, actually.
Yeah. So I would say we do one right now, but it's kind of in the morning on Sunday. So
yeah, well, at least we're drinking bourbon, so that's good.
Of course. So with Reward Summit, I know you mentioned that you pivoted that and you started a service-based IT consulting firm, Level. And I touched on this earlier, growing that to 200 people, 10 different offices, 4 different continents. Can you kind of touch on what Level is, how you grew it, et cetera?
Sure. So Level was very similar to what Amentra was, which is we would develop software, and we develop software for other companies. It started out as Chris and I going and helping out. I think McDonald's was one of our first clients. American Airlines was a very early one. But we would go in, and in those days, we would just go in for a week or two. They'd bought a piece of software, and we partnered with the software company. It was called Pivotal, and they would bring us in for big clients of theirs who had bought the software but were struggling to figure out how to do something with it. And so we would be very hands-on, helping them out with architecture, helping them out with writing code, helping them out with code reviews, helping them figure out how to replace whatever piece of software they were looking to replace. I mentioned before, we did that for about 6 months before we shut Reward Summit down and focused completely on Level. And we weren't calling it Level at the time. It was called Ladder Partners. And we went and we hired our first employee because we had so much work at the time that just Chris and I could no longer do the work. So we hired a guy named Sean Shealy who had worked at Amentra and then had gone on to work at Bank of America. So I came from the Amentra world, Chris came from the Bank of America world, and Sean came from both. He had done both. And then we hired another guy who had worked for me at Amentra and then worked for me at NextGrid, named Thomas McClure. And so there were 4 of us that really were the company at that point. And we were doing software development for companies. HD Supply was a very early client of ours. And really, we were just building software for companies who couldn't figure it out on their own.
How did you get? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. How did you generate your first customers? Because I know you mentioned McDonald's as one.
So that was all a company called Pivotal that was spun out of VMware, and they had a series of products, and I had a lot of knowledge about those products. And Chris had knowledge of some of their products, but he ramped up very quickly on the ones that he had not worked with, and so we were really legitimate experts in a handful of technologies. There's a suite of open source tools that came from a company called SpringSource, and I mentioned Fit Tracker, the fitness app that I had built. I had built a lot of the back end for that on Spring, and so I knew some really esoteric components of Spring. And so the VMware team that was the predecessor to Pivotal knew that I was an expert in these technologies, and they'd call me from time to time and say, "Hey, can you go help American Airlines out? They want to use Spring MVC to do some replace a few proprietary web services that they've developed." And so that was really how we did our initial client acquisition. What ended up happening was word started getting out in our circle that we were doing consulting work, and so we landed our first client that was non-Pivotal related through a relationship in the early stage community. A guy named Jim Van Fleet had done some advisory work to a company called SmartBIM. They wanted him to come in and rewrite a bunch of things that they had, and they weren't really sure how to build these things. And they couldn't get the original contractors in, and he introduced us. And so SmartBIM became one of our very early clients. Ironically enough, Richard Sims was a guy that was running SmartBIM at the time, took a really big job at Siemens, and now Siemens is a big client of ours as well, wow. doing much bigger projects for Siemens because it's a much bigger budget. But there were a lot of stories like that. And ultimately, the real game changer for us was a client called the Clearinghouse. They operate the ACH network here in North America. On behalf of the banks. They're owned by 19 member banks, and the banks had asked them to build a mobile tokenization vault, which is a key component of any mobile wallet. And Chris and I knew a little bit about that, some of it through the Reward Summit days, but also Chris had worked on a couple projects for Bank of America, and we got our first big contract was with the Clearinghouse through Chris's network. They hired us to help design and ultimately architect this mobile tokenization vault. And in that process, we met some people that we ended up hiring into Level, and that really built the formation of what we call our payments practice, which is where we're probably the most differentiated. But for the first year, all of our lead generation was through our network. But as you start to do good work for companies, people leave. Now someone left the Clearinghouse and is at Associated Bank, and that's a big client of Level's now. And so you end up doing all sorts of business development just through your network. And if I had to guess, it's been a year since I was involved in the day-to-day at Level, but my guess is that still a quarter of the work that we're doing comes from somehow through that network. Eventually, we ended up hiring a sales guy, just a really senior sales guy, and we leveraged his network and his ability to sell. And then eventually we built a real marketing team and built an inside sales team, and actually can generate business from people that we don't know. But it was years into the experiment that we were able to make those kinds of investments.
Yeah. How excited were you when you got your first big customer for Level?
We were pretty excited.
Yeah.
I think for Chris, it was more exciting just because he had not been involved in something like this before. For me, I remembered the Amentra days, and so it was exciting. But I remember we got our first $25,000 payment from a client.
Yeah.
And Chris was like, let's take a picture of it. And I'm like, nah, we'll take a picture when it's 100,000. And then each one was exciting. I try not to celebrate too much, and I try not to get too down on things. And I probably to a fault, become almost robotic about it. But I'm a big believer that don't get too excited, because when things are good, they're going to get bad, and don't get too down in the dumps, because when they're bad, they're going to get better. And I try to focus on that kind of middle road. But it's definitely exciting. I think the most exciting was when we made our first sale through the inside sales team, because that's when I knew, even though it was a small deal, that's much more scalable and repeatable when you can sell to somebody that you don't know, and you can do it with somebody who isn't super senior and isn't a founder or isn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. That was probably the most exciting moment for me, was when we were able to take, an inside sales rep who's never going and visiting the client on site and generate business that way.
Yeah, it sounds like once that happens, that's when really all the parts are moving together, creating a fluid business operations. So what year did Level start? Remind me of that again.
We technically incorporated September of 2013, but we hired our first employee in April of 2014. That's when I think that it started. And then the following year, 2015, was when we rebranded it to Level. We raised some money from Matt, who was the CEO and founder of Amentra, and we also did NextGrid together. Or he was an investor in NextGrid as well. I got him to come take a look at Latta Partners. By then we were 12 people, and he said, I think you need to rebrand. I think you need to put some capital into this, and I think you need to really think a lot bigger than just being a Charlotte-based company. And so those were the three founding points: when we incorporated, when we hired our first employee, and then when we rebranded to Level. Yeah,
and then that's when you started expanding, creating an actual moving
parts together. 2015, we did $4 million in revenue.
Wow.
We did $1 million in revenue in 2014, and then we did $4 million in 2015.
Yeah. Wow. What steps can people take out there that are, they're past the idea phase, they've got their actual company incorporated. I know you mentioned from 2013 to 15, you brought on another employee. Like, what steps can the startup founders do to then eventually bring on a team?
Well, I think you need to articulate, maybe not a specific vision statement, but you need to somehow articulate your vision for the company. You need to articulate what you're going to do. You should put together a plan. I read a book called Traction, and they've got a framework called VTO, and we went through that in 2015, and it was very helpful for us. We defined our core values. We defined where we wanted to be in 5 years, where we wanted to be in 3 years, and where we wanted to be in 1 year, and we made it very concrete what we thought we were going to do to get to each of those. We ended up blowing through every single plan that we created, so the planning itself wasn't necessarily all that great, but I think defining what are the things that are who we are, the core values, and these are things that never change. I think that was very powerful for us, and I think that any founder who goes through that exercise will find it worthwhile. For me, putting together a pitch deck that you take to investors, even if it's investors that you know, which the first piece of money that we raised was from Matt, who I know very well. That was very informative, just articulating why somebody else should invest in you. And then you end up using that with going out and hiring employees. If you can't tell an employee why they should come work for you, they aren't going to come work for you. A lot of people always ask me, how did you guys build such a great team? And I tell them, well, first of all, Chris and I are both developers. So developers want to work with other talented developers. So once you're able to get a handful of really talented people, and it doesn't just have to be developers, it could be anybody, but once you start bringing in good people, that starts to snowball in a very good way. And along those lines, you need to do a good job of getting people out quickly who don't align with those core values. But you also need to be very careful. We woke up one day and we were 40 people, all of them white guys. There were a couple of women in the company, and we were very, we brought on a consultant and said, why is it? Why are we doing this? And he said, well, where are you? I asked him, I said, look, we tried to interview more minority candidates, people who don't look like everybody else in the company. And we only got 2 candidates, and those 2 both had offers from Microsoft and Google. And he said, well, where are you recruiting? And I said, well, Duke, UNC, UVA. And he's like, and you didn't find black candidates there. I'm surprised. and it was like, wow, why aren't we interviewing there? So that's the flip side, is that by tapping into your network, you get that effect that I talked about earlier, where you end up and it's hard. If we had grown to 200 people and still looked like just a bunch of white guys, all the same age, wearing nice suits, and it would have been that would have been what we were forever. But luckily, we realized that by the time we were 40 people and started to make some changes there.
Yeah. So when you and Chris really launched Level, you guys both have a significant amount of years of experience under your belt. What would you really offer up advice-wise to kind of entry-level startup guys who haven't had 15 or 20 years of experience?
Yes, get some people who do have some experience if you can. Make them advisors. Get them to invest in your company. That helps a lot. People like myself and now Chris who have had success want to be involved with other startups, want to be involved with talented people, and want to help out and provide mentorship. So not necessarily that you have to hire people who have that experience, but get them engaged somehow in your company. There's no substitute for the wisdom that you gain. You can be brilliant and have the ability to develop something game changing when you're 20, but you just don't have those experiences, and you need to find them somewhere for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question with Level. How did you really grow this to this top 6% fastest growing companies in America, and additionally with $40 million in annual revenue? I mean, what was some just key steps you took there?
So I mentioned before, investing in, to me, the process of building a company or any system is really identify what the biggest bottleneck is and chase that mercilessly. Just go after it and fix it. And then be aware there's going to be a new bottleneck. And if you just keep going after whatever the bottleneck is in your company, I think that's a very effective way to go. Now, we also had some strategy and some things that we thought about loosely, but largely it was just, okay, what's the biggest problem that we have right now? Sometimes you find the biggest problem. Usually it's sales. Sales is the hardest thing to do. And luckily we were very, very good at selling. Chris and I both know how to sell, and we complement one another in terms of the things that we do. We were able to get a very talented salesperson named Dave Carr, and he's just a master at selling. And we took risks to do that. We were $4 million a year company, and we had to give him, he was making $500,000 a year at his job at Red Hat at the time. And so you look and you say, do you pay somebody $500,000 a year when you're doing $4 million a year in sales? That's not very smart.
Yeah.
But if you want to get to $10 million a year in sales, that's what you do. So we invested very heavily in bringing on a rock star salesperson, because that had become the bottleneck. Chris and I couldn't do 100% of the selling anymore and keep growing it and keep running it. And we had Sean and we had Thomas, and by then we had a lot of other really talented people, but we needed to get a salesperson. Then at times the bottleneck becomes recruiting. So, and by the way, it paid off. We did 10 million our third year. So we went from 4 to 10.
Wow.
And it wasn't just bringing Dave on, but that was a big game changer for us for sure. But I think seeking out those bottlenecks, whether it be now we need to invest in marketing, at times you have to completely rip up your org chart and reorganize the entire company. And we've done that 2 or 3 times. We had times where we had to swap out the software that we were using, or you have to move into a bigger office. There's just always something that you have to do in order to get the kind of growth that you want. For us, also investing in new offices was a big deal. You mentioned 10 offices. We were had people in Europe, Singapore, Australia, and we even had a team that wasn't Level employees, but that did quite a bit of our work down in Argentina. And so anytime there were definitely times when the bottleneck was, well, we need to be in the UK because we have a client, an investment banking client, who wants to sell us a large project, but we need people on the ground in the UK, or we invested in the capability in Singapore and in Melbourne and Sydney, Australia. But there were all sorts of things we did along the way. But I don't think there was once you get past bringing on Dave Carr, the salesperson that I talked about, or we brought on a guy named Scott Harkey who launched our payment practice for us. Early on, there were single things you could point to like that were game changers. We brought on a guy named Brian DeStacy to lead recruiting, and he was able to just massively ramp the team at a time when we were selling a lot. But what you get to a point where there's not any one thing that you're doing anymore. You're trying 5 or 6 things, and you don't know which thing's going to work. You know that if you try 5 things and 2 of them work, you're probably you're probably doing pretty well.
Yeah,
and you're going to continue to grow. But in the early going, there were definitely some big bets we took, like Scott Harkey, Dave Carr, that I mentioned.
Yeah, and then taking those calculated risks that you mentioned prior.
Yep.
So when you were growing up, I mean, you've had some exponential success. First off, congratulations on how everything's going, as well as what you've really built. When you were growing up, especially in your kind of like mid-20s, did you have a vision of like, all right, this is what I want to be, this is how I'm going to get there? Or was it just like, I'm going to execute as hard as I can?
Yeah, that's funny. I think I did. My dad, my brother and I graduated the same. He's 2 years younger. We both graduated in 2000 from undergrad. Mm-hmm. And my dad, we were hanging out with the family after the two ceremonies in the same weekend. And he said, well, guys, how are you going to make $1 million? And my brother said, well, I'm making this now and I'll get a 5% a year increase. And by this point, I'll have made $1 million. And he's like, okay, John. And I was like, well, I'm going to learn a lot at Talon, and then I'm going to start my own consulting company. And it was funny. He was like, yeah, that's the answer. He was like, and my brother is much smarter than I am, graduated number 1 at UVA, but wow. he just thinks very differently about life than I do. So I won't say that I had a vision for starting Level, even though I made that comment. And I even remember working at one of the stereo shops, and I met these guys who had a consulting company, and they were doing app dev, and I didn't know that I wanted to do application development. And I remember going to my dad and saying, man, I met these two guys. I'm going to start a consulting company. That's the thing to do. And so I always knew that, but I don't, I think it was once I went to a Mentra, and probably I'd started to think, well, maybe I'll build a product and that'll be what I do. But then when I saw what Mike and Matt were doing with a Mentra, I was like, yeah, actually I could do this. Like I'm going to keep learning from these guys. They really know what they're doing, and they're willing to teach me. And so yeah, I mean, I think it was a combination of things. The gentleman I mentioned that was the founder of NextGrid, the CEO of NextGrid, I had worked for him in the stereo shops before, and he had always really inspired me, not necessarily to take the exact path that I took, but just he was always starting his own companies and doing well with them, and then he'd sell them. Not at the scale of what we did with a Mentra or any of these other things, not at the scale that we're doing with NextGrid, but he'd start a stereo shop, or he'd start a tinning company, or he'd start a company selling cell phones or DirecTV. And I think when you see enough of those, you start to realize like, wow, that's the real way to do it, is with my personality and the way that I like to take risks and the way that I like to learn. That's just a real natural, it was just something that seemed obvious to me that I needed to do.
Yeah. And I think that really goes back to that your environment growing up really does shape who you are in the future.
Absolutely.
People around you, places you are, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you think is the biggest struggle that entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs really are facing currently?
So a lot of them think it's that they can't raise money. And I don't think that's the problem. I mean, I think the problem for most would-be entrepreneurs is they're probably comfortable in what they're doing, and you're going to be very uncomfortable going out and starting on your own. And I think they wait for the perfect storm of things. And then they think, okay, well, I need to go raise money because that's going to give me the comfort that I need to be able to go do this. And of course, you can't raise money that way. It's impossible. It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's the biggest thing that people struggle with. I think once they start, people struggle with prioritizing and working on what's important and not just urgent. Too often, once you get started, you fall into this trap where you're only working on the things that are urgent, and you miss the things that are actually important. And that's what you really need to wake up every day and have a clarity of, okay, what's important that I do today? And not to say that you ignore the other things, because you'll get tunnel vision and you won't find the best opportunities, but to have this just maniacal focus on what's the one thing I can improve today, or what are the 2 or 3 things that I need to get done today. I think that's the trap that a lot of people fall into once they actually get started and get going. And it's why they start to struggle to grow, because they start working on things that aren't important, or they've got people around them. I heard something brilliant the other day. There's 2 types of people who energize a room. Some people energize it when they walk into the room, and some people energize it when they walk out of the room. and the key is to surround yourself with the people who energize it when they walk into the room, and get rid of the people as soon as you can that energize it when they walk out. And I think that's the other problem a lot of startups have, is that as you grow the company, people who got you there aren't necessarily the people who will get you to the next place. And it's hard because you want to be loyal to those people, but you ultimately have to get them out of the way somehow, whether it's forcing them out of the company or changing their role. And that's another thing that stifles growth and that entrepreneurs get tripped up on along the way.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to pivoting, not only pivoting the products and services you're offering, but pivoting on the people that are around you, and having people who feel the energy in the room when they're in there, not when they have left.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, of course. So I want to give you an opportunity to touch on Lobby CRE, if you wouldn't mind. I know you're really excited about that, especially with how much commercial real estate is growing, not only in Charlotte, but worldwide right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. So Lobby CRE is a data management platform that was developed out of a holding company here in Charlotte called 30 Capital. 30 Capital is run by a very successful guy named Rob Finlay. He's the mastermind and owner of IMS, which is a very successful commercial real estate company here in Charlotte. I met him in the early days of IMS. He had started a company called Quiet Stream Financial that had probably 15 or 16 subsidiary companies. And ultimately he collected a couple of them together and rolled that out as IMS, sold a couple of the others. But he also owns a company called Commercial Defeasance, which is one of the most successful commercial real estate companies, arguably in the world. He started it about 18 years ago. He owns a large portfolio of properties. He owns Commercial Defeasance, which is really almost a banker of sorts to the commercial real estate industry. And as a result of managing all of those properties and all of the financial transactions that he manages, he has developed a holding company that he incubates software ideas for his own companies. And so he's built a handful of products through the last decade. And Lobby was one he was one of our earlier clients, one of our early big clients. And so we became kind of friendly through that process, and I'd always admired him. And Lobby is a data management platform that he developed for pulling in all the different data sources. There's all sorts of data that you're looking at if you're a commercial real estate owner. You're on the acquisition side, you might be looking at an offering memorandum. You might be looking at 30 of them in a month. They're these information packets that your broker sends you when you're thinking about buying new properties. Once you already own a property, you've got a property management system like RealPage or Yardi or RentMan. You've got lease management systems. You've got cash forecasting systems. You've got all sorts of spreadsheet models that you develop to do your reporting to your investors. You've got all sorts of reports that you have to send to your banks. And so he was always building applications and then having to integrate with all these data sources. And he said, why don't I start with a data management platform that makes it easier to integrate and make that the product? And so he was talking about this 4 years ago when I first met him.
Wow.
And I helped him out with a couple things related to it. And then once I had moved on from the day-to-day level, we started talking about getting more serious about this data management platform. And ultimately he developed it and was using it for his own portfolio. And he realized that he didn't want to he thought that this needed to be its own company, not just sit inside of his holding company. So he approached me. We did a joint venture. I'm the CEO of it. I work full time on it. I've inherited he contributed a sales team, a marketing team, a product team, and an app dev team. So we've got about 15, 16 employees at this point. It's a funded company, so we don't need to go raise money. We've landed 3 customers to date, and we've got probably 3 or 4 more that are coming into our early adopter program. And next year is when we're really going to focus on scaling it. This year is all about figuring out the messaging, figuring out what the product is. It is a data management platform, which means we ingest data, we store that data, we transform that data, we do ETL and data pipelining, and then we ultimately structure that data into a data warehouse. And then we have reporting that sits on top of it. And really figuring out what type of reporting we need to do and what our customers can best use the platform for is really what we're doing right now with our early adopters.
Yeah, and you said that was started in 2014, right? Or about
4 No. 2014 was when IMS was really going, and he started developing the concept of it. The real development just happened this year, and it became our partnership and started in July. Yeah. So I joined in mid-July with Rob and took over as the CEO in July, and I would say that really they started building the current version of the software in April, if I had to guess.
Yeah, and is it just commercial, or do you touch on any residential at all?
It's strictly commercial, and it's really from the perspective of companies that own real estate. So we're not looking at the brokerages, we're not looking at the bankers. We're really focused on the companies, what you'd call a GP. So when you structure a real estate fund or a private equity fund, you have one lead investor who's the general partner or the GP, and then they bring on LPs or limited partners. And we're really focused on selling to the GPs. And the biggest investors in the space are publicly traded REITs, REITs, real estate investment trusts. And ultimately we could sell to them as well. But our real target market are these guys and gals who are GPs and getting together a group of investors to go buy commercial real estate properties.
And they need the data to actually monitor what's happening with the property.
To monitor what's there's really three things that they need that they use the data for, or three buyer personas. One is the owner or the finance function who needs to do investor reporting across all these different systems. One persona is acquisition, or the person who's going out and actually acquiring new properties and looking at new properties and deciding when and which ones to buy. And the finance function is much more, how do I do reporting to my investors? When should I sell? And when should I refinance? And then the third persona is the asset manager or the operations. They're really looking at, how do I make the most money for these assets that I've already bought? And those are the three kind of functions that we support through the platform.
Yeah, and you can have the platform all rolled up into one place and just have an easily accessible platform.
You get everything. You get everything right there, and you can build other applications on top of it, because the data, once it's all put together and normalized and harmonized and cleaned up, it isn't just our application that gets to take advantage of that. Other applications can then be built on top of it as well.
So it can integrate.
Yep.
Okay, great. Just a few other quick follow-up questions. I know we have Sunday football on, can't really miss too much of that. So with startups, I know you seem like a very thorough investor. What do you really look for? Just a couple key things in entry startups that you like to invest in.
So number one, it's the team. I mean, it's almost cliche to say that, but it's so true. Number one, I want people that I believe in, that have that confidence, that have that ability to be stubborn when they need to, but to pivot and not be so wedded to their idea that they miss the real opportunity. Number two, there's just certain spaces that I like better than others because I understand them better. So it's much easier to invest in something that I can wrap my head around. So I've done a couple of health-oriented investments because I'm so into fitness and nutrition and that sort of thing. So I've invested in a healthy restaurant concept that was introduced to me. It was founded by Matt, who was the founder of Amentra. And so we've invested in quite a few things together. I've now invested in his healthy restaurant concept called Dirt. There's another one called Next Bar that's a ketogenic nutrition bar that I feel very, very firmly about, and it's a space that I understand. And it's led by a gentleman who is very, very talented and has it, I believe. And so that's one thing, if I understand the industry. But there's other things that I don't necessarily understand, but I just see somebody who's just so completely awesome that I feel like, okay, I'm going to invest in them. And that was an example of that is Maggie Williams, who's the founder of Skipper, which is a dog walking service. We built their MVP, and she and her husband Sebastian, who's no longer in the day-to-day of the company, but it was her COO at the time. You could just tell that they were awesome. And so I invested in, I think, their second round, even though I don't really know anything about dog walking or how you scale it or that sort of thing. Same thing, I invested in 2U Laundry because Alex and Dan are just fantastic business people. And in their case, they also have a real track record of building a successful business, and they've got a growth plan in front of them. So not just that I really like Alex and Dan, I knew nothing about the laundry industry. Right. And it wasn't something that I was seeking out, but they really understand the industry, but they've also got an opportunity, and they've raised $6 million, and their plan for how they're going to deploy it is I think a very good plan. And so that's the other thing is I want to see a plan. What are you going to do? How are you going to scale this? Is this something that can grow a lot? Nobody wants to invest in or work for somebody else's lifestyle business. So and so you want things that are going to potentially grow very, very quickly and have a long runway so that there can be a big exit and you can get a lot of return as an investor from that sort of thing.
Yeah. Are you a Shark Tank fan?
I've never watched it, to be honest.
Really? Okay.
I'm not that into the concept. I do like to go to the pitch breakfast event here. Yeah. But I shouldn't say it because I've literally never seen an episode of Shark Tank. I just I can just imagine the format and the what they're doing for the TV audience, and I just can't imagine that I would enjoy it too much.
I'll send you an older episode that's not as cheesy.
Okay.
Just as I mentioned earlier, you've had some exponential success just in a ton of different industries, and you really look for really thorough investments within startups. What's some really final advice you would offer for anyone out there who's really just either trying to grow in their career or grow their business, or really just build success at an early age for themselves?
Yeah. I would say, just echo what we talked about earlier. Build your skills, build your network, get out there in the community. There are meetup events going on where there's startup founders. Try to seek out events where there are actual founders and not just people talking about it. Try to have conversations with the actual founders or people who are very early on in the company. They're busy as hell, but they want to help. They want people to know their story. And I would say that as you seek those people out, just be very respectful of their time and make sure that that just make sure that if you get 30 minutes of someone's time while they're running a startup company, that you don't waste their time and that you're respectful of it.
Yeah. What one more question? What's some books you would recommend? Because I know you touched on them earlier. Sure.
So the two that I recommend for anybody are definitely 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and then The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz fame, and but I think both of them are brilliant for different reasons. But definitely, I recommend those very highly. I think that another really good book that everybody should read is called Bad Blood, and it's an example of how things go wrong in Silicon Valley. It's about Theranos, and it's a fascinating story about just a train wreck of a company that at one point grew faster than Facebook and Uber combined.
Wow, they're ultimately train wrecked, huh?
Yeah, it's called Bad Blood. It's really good. Eventually, they're going to have to make a movie about it because it's an amazing story of it was all a lie. Like at some point, it all turned into a lie, and they actively deceived people, and billions of dollars were lost, and multiple careers were ruined along the way. All sorts of cover up. There were two different there were members of the George Bush Senior White House that were involved in it, and there were members of the Obama administration that were part of it. I mean, it's really fascinating what a train wreck this thing turned out to be. It's just a great example of the opposite of good leadership and the opposite of what you should do.
For anyone who wants to connect with you or just look more into Lobby, CRE, or even your story with Level or Reward Summit, where's a place like on Google or somewhere?
Yeah, sure. So you can go to my podcast is the Defiance Ventures podcast. It's available. I host it on Anchor. You can find it on Anchor, but it's also available on the Play Store, on Apple Podcast, Spotify, all the major platforms. Again, it's called the Defiance Ventures podcast. I probably release 3 or 4 a month. I don't do it as often as I would like to since I've joined Lobby. That's a good spot. You can follow me on. I'm not all that active on Twitter, but it's JSB713. You can follow me on LinkedIn. It's John Espey. You'll know it's me when you see the Lobby and the Reward Summit and NextGrid and all the companies that we've talked about on here. Those are probably the best places. I'm launching for my holding company. It's called Defiance, and I'm launching the website for that. It's defiance.company. It's not available yet. It's literally being built as we speak, but eventually I'll have a blog, and it'll also reference all of my content. I've got a YouTube channel. The Defiance Ventures podcast has a YouTube channel as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, once again, thanks for really spending your time and giving some amazing insights for the Next Level Minds podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it. I hope people get something out of it.
Of course. And everyone out there that had the opportunity to listen, just first and foremost, thanks again for tuning into this week's episode. I got a lot of value out of talking with John of just really leveraging your networks, but not building them in a selfish way, building them to help other people, as well as early on in your career. Don't just focus on the next 5 or $100,000, focus on how you can learn from the opportunity at hand. And then again, in the entrepreneurial space, really just growing your company, surrounding yourself with the resources and people that you need. And really something that I think a lot of people, including myself, struggle with is knowing when to pivot. Don't become too obsessed with the product. Really pivot if you need to. And once again, I wanted to personally thank each and every one of you for tuning in to this week's episode of Next Level Minds. And as we like to say here, your mindset is your greatest weapon for the battle of success.